Hi guys, it's Ms. Faye, and today we're going to be covering genetic disorders. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to describe how some disorders are caused by recessive alleles, while others are caused by dominant alleles. You should be able to define carrier, sex-linked genes, karyotype, and also understand how karyotypes are used in order to predict chromosomal disorders. Now, in a human body, there are two kinds of chromosomes, sex chromosomes and autosomes. Sex chromosomes determine whether or not the person is biologically male or biologically female, while autosomes contain genes that determine traits not related to sex, so not related to gender. And these things could be the shape of the hair, the skin color, height, having dimples, having freckles, so all of these like physical characteristics that exist in both males and females. Now, if we take a look here at this diagram, this is known as a karyotype. And a karyotype is essentially a map of all the chromosomes that we have in the human body. Okay, so a karyotype is essentially a map of all of these chromosomes that we have. The first 22 pairs, so all of these chromosomes, the first 22 pairs, these are known as autosomes, okay? So autosomes, remember, they determine physical traits not related to sex. And these are the traits that Mendel was studying. So he wasn't really looking at humans, he was looking at plants, but he was looking at like petal color and pea shape and all of these traits that exist in both male and female flowers. The second type of chromosomes that we have are sex chromosomes, and this is going to be the last pair. So the 23rd pair is either, so you'll either have an XX if you're a female, or an XY chromosome if you are a male. Both of these are known as sex chromosomes. Females have an XX chromosome, males have an XY, and you'll see that in males, the Y chromosome is a lot shorter. So the Y chromosome is a lot shorter than the X chromosome, which ends up resulting in a lot of the phenotypic variations that exist between both males and females. All right. Now, like we mentioned, some of these genes or some of these chromosomes that are known as autosomes, they contain genes known as autosomal genes that basically determine physical characteristics. An example of that is a widow's peak, having a widow's peak. And as you can see, a widow's peak is when a person does not have a straight hairline. So I have actually a widow's peak. You'll notice like a dip in your hairline. Another trait is having a hitchhiker's thumb. So if your thumb is straight-ish, like mine, that's not having a hitchhiker's thumb. Some people's thumbs can bend really backwards, just like you see in the picture. That is known as a hitchhiker's thumbs. There are so many other traits that you can kind of research and look into and kind of like take a look at these differences that are existing in your own families, between your own family members. You're going to notice so many variations in traits. All of these traits are caused by autosomal genes. Sometimes, however, these autosomal genes end up getting a random mutation. So during development, when a person is developing, these autosomal genes might inherit or might end up with a random mutation, and this will cause autosomal gene disorders, diseases that are caused by mutations and changes to the genes that are found on autosomal chromosomes. So either pair 1 to 22. So pair 1 to 22, the chromosomes that we saw in the previous karyotype, there will be a random mutation that will affect these genes. These are known as autosomal genes. And when there are genetic disorders that are autosomal, these disorders can be predicted, meaning that you can actually do genetic testing before a baby is born, and you could figure out, using the laws of probability again, if the baby is going to inherit these genetic disorders. And this is actually something that's done quite often, especially when people first get married. They try to figure out if they're genetically compatible per se, or if their children are at risk for certain genetic disorders. So disorders will be either caused by two recessive alleles or a dominant allele. So in other words, the disorders, these genetic autosomal disorders, will either be recessive or dominant. Let's look at the first example. Let's look at diseases that are caused by recessive alleles. Now, since this disease is caused by a recessive allele, the person must inherit 2 copies of this allele in order to exhibit the symptoms of the disease, in order to have the disease, all right? So this type of disease will only show when both parents are heterozygous, and we're gonna see an example of that later. When it comes to recessive diseases, there are 2 scenarios. Either a person will be homozygous recessive. So let's kind of, I'm gonna go ahead and represent, I'm gonna represent the disease gene with the letter D. Okay, so let's assume that this is a recessive disease. So capital D means the person will be normal or have the disease if this is a recessive disease. Capital D, this allele, or the dominant allele, means the person is normal. Because remember, this is a recessive allele. And we represent recessive alleles with lowercase. And this is a recessive disease, sorry. So this means that lowercase d, recessive D, is going to mean that the person will have the disease. So if a person is homozygous recessive, first of all, homo means same and recessive means lowercase. They will have the following genotype. And this means they will have the disease and they will show the symptoms. On the other hand, if a person is heterozygous, meaning they have the following genotype, they will not have the disease. They will not have the symptoms. However, they will be carriers. What does that mean? What does the word carrier mean? Well, we can kind of guess, right? Just from the name. A carrier is someone that doesn't have the disease. They don't have the symptoms. However, they carry the allele that can cause the disease, and they can pass it on to their offspring. They can pass it on to their children. And you'll notice that a heterozygous person will contain, right here, we can see it, the lowercase allele. This is the disease-causing allele. So they do have it, but they don't have the symptoms, okay? Which means they can pass it on. Let's take a look at an example of a specific recessive disease. This is known as, cystic fibrosis. And you might have heard of cystic fibrosis. You might know someone that suffers from cystic fibrosis. It is a very, very difficult disease to suffer from. These people don't have very, ideal quality of life. They often have very short lifespans, so they pass away very early. Around age 38 is the life expectancy, because of the fact that this disease is so serious and severe, and it affects the respiratory system. It ends up having the body build way too much mucus, and it ends up clogging the airways. Eventually, the person basically suffocates, and they can no longer survive. So this is a disease that is caused by a recessive autosomal genetic mutation, meaning that it is a recessive disease. Let's take a look at this example. So here we see that 2 parents, and the father and the mother are both carriers of this disease. So right away, if you hear the word carrier, you know that they are talking about heterozygous. These people are heterozygous. So it tells you in the question that the uppercase C is representing a normal allele, and the lowercase c is representing having the cystic fibrosis disease. Again, having the disease is represented by a recessive allele, a lowercase letter, because it's a recessive disease. So if both parents, mom and dad, are heterozygous, I went ahead of myself. So if they're both carriers, then they must be heterozygous. So I will represent their genotype as such. All right, let's create a Punnett square representing a cross, a genetic cross between both of these parents. So let me say that this is mom on this side and this is dad, and it doesn't really matter who's on which side. Again, we already established that it's arbitrary. So let's do the cross. So the dad will be, the first child will be homozygous dominant, the second child will be heterozygous, the third child will be heterozygous, and finally homozygous recessive. So let us answer the questions on the left here. First question, what is the percentage that the offspring is a carrier? And remember, if the offspring is a carrier, they are what? Heterozygous. So let's take a look at our results here. So is this person heterozygous? Nope. What about this person? Yes. This person, yes. What about this genotype? Nope. So there's a 50% chance that the child will be heterozygous, will be a carrier. What percentage of the offspring will have this disease? Remember, to have the disease, since this is a recessive disease, the person must be homozygous recessive to get it. So the only chance is this person. Okay, so they must have this genotype to get the disease. So there's a 25% chance. 1 out of 4, 25% chance of having the disease. What percentage of the offspring will not have the disease? All these three genotypes will not have the disease. They will be in the clear. Why? Because this person is homozygous dominant. They don't even have the allele for cystic fibrosis, so they definitely will be healthy. And these two are carriers, so they will be healthy. So percentage of offspring that will not have the disease, 75%, which is 3 out of 4. You can do that on a calculator to double check. And then what percentage of the offspring are homozygous? So in order to be homozygous, you have to have 2 copies, identical copies of the allele. You could either be homozygous dominant, such as here, or homozygous recessive, such as here. So 50% chance, there's a 50% chance that the child will be homozygous or will have a homozygous genotype. What about heterozygous, aka carrier? Again, we also see a 50% chance of being a carrier or of being heterozygous. Okay, so that's in terms of a recessive genetic disorder. Again, we're still autosomal, meaning that this is happening on an autosomal chromosome. Let's take a look at a dominant disorder. Now, dominant disorders also happen on autosomes. They're happening on the same types of chromosomes. However, in order to get this disease, you only need to have a dominant allele. So whether you're heterozygous or homozygous dominant, you get the disease. They are a lot less common, okay? And there's no such thing as a carrier in this situation because it's a dominant, this disease is caused by a dominant allele. So heterozygous and homozygous dominant individuals will be affected, and this disease doesn't occur until later in life. So people might have already had children without even knowing. And that's why doing genetic testing before getting married or deciding to have children is very important, because sometimes you have these disorders, no symptoms until much later in life, which we will see in one example coming up next. So the specific example that I'm looking at is Huntington's disease, and this is a disease that is really terrible. It affects motor skills over time, and this usually shows, the symptoms of this disease start to show later, so when a person is 45 years plus, okay, middle-aged. And again, it affects motor skills. A person starts to kind of lose control of their muscles, and it just degrades and gets worse with age, and it becomes debilitating in terms of having a healthy and nice quality of life. Okay, so Huntington's disease is a dominant disease, and you'll notice that I indicated that because the dominant allele, okay, oops, The dominant allele represents the disease, capital H, okay? Dominant means they have the disease, and lowercase means that they do not have the disease. So the example says, ignore this. I don't know why I have this timer is probably from last year. A father who is heterozygous for the disease. So the word heterozygous means that they have the following genotype. I'm putting the father up here. And a mother who is homozygous recessive. So she has, oh, sorry, I forgot that I'm representing the disease with an H. It really won't matter. Remember, these letters are arbitrary. I can put anything. So the mom is homozygous recessive. Oh, what happened there? These pens, they're really annoying to use. But anyways, so dad is heterozygous, mom is homozygous recessive, and they decide to have a baby. Let's first do the cross. So the first genotype will be heterozygous. The second genotype will be homozygous recessive. Then we have another heterozygous. And finally, homozygous recessive. Okay, so the first question asks us, what is the genotype? What is the genotype of the father, which we've already done? So genotype of the father is, I'll just write it. He's heterozygous, so genotype of the mother. What percentage of offspring will have Huntington's? Keep in mind, this is a dominant disease, meaning that you get it if you have one copy of the dominant allele. So whether you have this, right up here, whether you have this genotype or this genotype, you will get Huntington's because it's a dominant disease. The only scenario where you will not have the disease is if you're homozygous recessive, so you have this genotype. So what percentage of offspring will have Huntington's? Definitely this and this. So there's a 50% chance of having Huntington's, and then there's a 50% chance of not having it, okay? So your chances for getting this disease are a lot higher than if you were to have children. If a person that has Huntington's was to have children, there's a much higher risk of having a child that has Huntington's than if it was a recessive disease, okay? So we've talked about examples of diseases that are caused by mutations that happen on the gene, on the chromosomes, or on the genes. There's also chromosomal disorders when a person has too many chromosomes, okay? So issues with the number of chromosomes. So the mutation isn't necessarily happening on the chromosome itself. You're getting duplications or omissions of the entire chromosome. So you're either missing an entire chromosome or you have an extra entire chromosome with the genes that come with it, all right? So this is known as chromosomal disorder. And this table down here shows a bunch of examples, but the most common one that we might have heard about, or you might know someone that has this disorder, is Down syndrome, okay? So a normal healthy cell contains 46 chromosomes. If a person has a chromosomal disorder, they will have either 47 chromosomes or 45. So either too much, an extra chromosome, or not enough. So you'll notice that in Down syndrome, a person has an extra chromosome. So on the 21st chromosome, they have an extra chromosome. The same with Edwards syndrome and Patau's syndrome. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And then, for example, these two, there's a deletion. So there's actually, the person is missing a chromosome, and so on and so forth. So here's a karyotype, and karyotypes are excellent tools for mapping out all the chromosomes that a person has, but also figuring out these chromosomal disorders. Because if you look at a karyotype of a person, right away you notice there's something wrong here, right? On the 21st chromosome, there is an extra chromosome, because every single, our chromosomes usually come in pairs. So if all of a sudden you see that the person has an extra chromosome and it's happening on the 21st chromosome, right away we know that this is Down syndrome. So karyotypes are excellent tools for predicting genetic diseases and also diagnosing genetic diseases. specifically chromosomal disorders. So the last thing I want to talk about today is this idea of having sex-linked genes. So far we said that all of these disorders that are going on in terms of the genetic disorders were happening on autosomal chromosomes. What if the disorder happens on a sex chromosome, on an X or a Y chromosome? When that happens, so when a trait or a disease are associated with either an X or a Y chromosome, meaning they're sex-linked, we call these sex-linked genes. So these are genes that are either located on the X chromosome or on the Y chromosome. Now, females can only pass X chromosomes because that's the only ones they've got, right? We only have X chromosomes, while males can either pass an X chromosome or a Y chromosome because they have both. So in other words, the X chromosome has a bigger influence on the phenotype than the Y chromosome because there's a higher chance of inheriting an X chromosome than a Y chromosome, if that makes sense. An example of a sex-linked disease or disorder is hemophilia. And hemophilia is a rare disorder that affects almost exclusively males. So the majority of hemophiliacs are males. And this is because this disease is inherited on an X chromosome. It's X-linked, meaning that it's found on the X chromosome. And there are two types of this disease, hemophilia A and B. And depending on basically you figure out which type of hemophilia is present, depending on which gene it is showing up on. The symptoms are going to be the same. People with hemophilia, they have a much harder time recovering from bruises, okay? They have a much harder time forming clots, meaning that they have a higher risk of bleeding out, etc. Okay, so here we have an example of a sex-linked gene, which is hemophilia. I don't want to go through this just because I don't want to confuse you. For the purposes of this year, you don't need to be able to analyze sex-linked Punnett squares. You just need to know what sex-linked genes are, as you notice in the learning targets. So you mainly need to know that sex-linked disorders are found on the X chromosome. Okay, they are found on the X chromosome. Now, why are more males affected with sex-linked disorders than females? So if you notice in the example of hemophilia, almost all hemophiliacs are males. Why is that? Why don't females get affected as much as males? Well, think about it. Remember that this disease, the sex-linked disease, is found on the X chromosome, all right? And all males contain an X chromosome, and a Y chromosome, while females contain 2 copies of this X chromosome. Now, the Y chromosome for every male for sure will come from the dad, because where else would it come, right? Females don't have a Y chromosome. So this definitely came from dad. But which X they inherit, it could have came from mom or it could have came from dad. Same thing with the females, right? One of these X's came from mom, one of it came from dad. Which one it is a pure random event. Again, that is why we use probability. However, the secret lies in the fact that females, since they have 2 copies of the X chromosome, they have the advantage of being heterozygous. Okay, so this is known as having a heterozygous advantage. What does that mean? It means that they can be carriers. They have the ability to be carriers. If the disease is sex-linked on the X chromosome and it's recessive, they might get the following genotype, meaning that they are carriers, okay? On the other hand, males will either have the disease, okay? Sorry, this is, if it's a recessive disease, this means they're normal. So they will either not have the disease, or they will either have the disease. So they have a 50-50% chance. They might have the disease if they inherit the damaged or the mutated X chromosome, or they might be healthy if they inherit the healthy X chromosome. While females can either be healthy have the disease or be carriers, meaning they don't have the disease but they can pass it on, but still they don't have any symptoms, which is what you want. You don't want to have any symptoms of the disease. And this is why females are less likely to inherit X-linked genetic disorders or sex-linked genetic disorders, because they have the heterozygous advantage. All right, that's it for today's lesson. As usual, if you have any questions, please let me know. Have a great day.